Welcome everyone to this morning's session. We've got a great audience in the room here. We've also got welcome those that are joining us remotely via webinar. This session is Let's Talk Seismic in a language we can all understand, presented by Brent Maxfield. You can see the PDH code up on the screen. It is 44174. My name is Troy Dye. I am with ARW Engineers out of Ogden, Utah, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. Just a couple quick announcements, and then we'll jump into the presentation. Just remember to obtain your PDH codes. You can go and visit online through the app or in the computers out in the hallway. For this presentation, the speaker will address questions at the end of his presentation. And for those in the room, just simply raise your hand, and those in the remote audience, you'll find instructions for submitting questions included on the viewing page. I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Brent Maxfield is a professional structural engineer with more than 30 years experience working on structural and seismic projects throughout the world. He is currently employed by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In 2012, Brent was named the Utah Engineer of the Year by the Utah Engineers Council. We're very pleased to have Brent present, and please help me welcome him.
Good morning and welcome to our online audience. It's fun to have many of you joining from around the country and maybe even the world. Today we're going to talk seismic, but I need to do a little bookkeeping here to begin with. This is an AIA CES certified presentation, so as part of that I need to give you a session description and also some learning objectives, which I'll give you in just a few slides. How many architects do we have in our audience here? Good, welcome. It's great to have some architects. How many structural engineers? Well, looks like most of you. Any from the construction industry? Fabricators, erectors, wonderful. Good to have you all with us. So here's a session description, and then I'll talk a little bit about just a few slides, and then we'll give you the learning objectives. The intent of this session is to help bridge the current seismic communication gap. This session will help engineers explain seismic concepts to a non-technical audience, and will help the non-technical audience better grasp the intent of modern seismic design. And understanding these concepts will help facilitate informed decisions regarding seismic risk. So I really am trying to bring structural engineers to a common language, so as we talk to architects, building owners, and the community, we can talk in a language that is more easily understood by all of these non-technical audiences. Seismic, it's a complex language. And if we're going to talk seismic in a language that we can all understand, we need to move from the complex seismic language and move to using simplified terms that we can all understand. When I talk seismic, and when we talk seismic, most of us think about earthquakes. But today I'd like to create a paradigm shift. I would like all of us to start thinking of things other than earthquakes when we talk seismic. Because in order to have informed seismic risk discussions, we need to move from a conversation of earthquakes to having a conversation about shaking. I've put up here two sayings that I hope will help create that, or begin that paradigm shift from earthquakes to shaking. The first one I think is self-explanatory. When the earth quakes, the ground shakes. I think we all understand that, but I don't think we really think about that. Because number two, it's all about the shake and the quake. And I hope by the end of our presentation today, you'll really understand that it's more important to understand the shaking than anything else after an earthquake. So since we're talking about shaking, I wanted to give you a view of what shaking looks like. Now we can use terms to help describe shaking. What are some terms that you would use as you look at those videos on shaking? How would you describe that shaking? Just yell some out. Scary. Violent. Unpredictable. Did somebody say like traumatic? Dynamic. Okay, so those are all terms that we can use to help describe shaking. And we'll start using some additional terms as we go through our discussion today. So here's our 4 learning objectives for our AIA certification. As a result of this presentation, the participants will be able to, 1, explain why it is more important to know the shaking intensity than the earthquake magnitude to understand building damage. 2, explain how ShakeMap can help you understand the levels of damage in an area following an earthquake. 3, explain MCER shaking level and the risk of collapse for new buildings. And 4, list the damage that could occur to a new building if it experiences the design shaking intensity. Let's start off by talking about magnitude, because magnitude's comfortable. Most of us in this room and most of the public have a general understanding of magnitude. I think we all have a sense that as a magnitude increases, the earthquake becomes larger. A 9 is greater than an 8, is greater than a 7, etc. The news likes to report magnitude, so we hear about magnitude all the time on the news. And people like to ask us as engineers about magnitude. So we can't ignore magnitude because it's important. But let me talk a little bit about some of the things that we know about magnitude. The first one is that magnitude affects area. So I've got on the screen 2 different earthquakes. The one on the left is the 2011 Christchurch, New Zealand earthquake. It was a magnitude 6.3. The one on the right is the magnitude 8.8 Biobío, Chile earthquake, which was a magnitude 8.8. These maps are drawn to the same scale. You can see that the magnitude 6.3 Christchurch earthquake was pretty much focused right in the general vicinity of Christchurch, New Zealand. The Chile earthquake, on the other hand, extended over a large portion of the country. And if you look at that, you can see that the extent and influence of that earthquake covered almost the entire country of New Zealand. So as we talk about magnitude, we need to understand that magnitude affects area. The other thing about magnitude is magnitude affects the duration of shaking. I've got 2 shaking records on the screen. The upper one is from the magnitude 6.8 Nisqually earthquake in Washington. The intense shaking from this earthquake lasted just a matter of seconds. The record on the bottom was from the Japan earthquake of 2011. In this case, the shaking went on for a period of minutes. So as we get larger in earthquake, we could expect generally that the shaking is going to last longer in larger magnitude earthquakes. Now that's important when we talk about building design, because buildings that are being shaken for a short period of time versus the same level of shaking over a long period of time can have much different impact on those buildings. So I don't want to diminish the importance of magnitude, but I do want to talk about a couple other things in just a minute. So when we talk about the effects of earthquakes, these are 2 important concepts to consider. Number 1, a specific magnitude earthquake does not equal a specific level of shaking. And I'll demonstrate that in just a couple of slides. And number 2, larger magnitude earthquakes have the potential for larger shaking, because it really is all about the shake and the quake. So what do we know about earthquakes? Well, we know that one earthquake could be different from another earthquake in terms of shaking levels. We know that the shaking levels from the same earthquake can vary from one location to another. We know that as earthquake magnitude gets larger, there's a potential for larger shaking. But we also know that smaller magnitude earthquakes can cause high levels of shaking. And let me demonstrate that with the Christchurch, New Zealand earthquake. Typically, when there's a magnitude 6.3 earthquake somewhere in the world, it never makes the news. Generally, these earthquakes have smaller shaking levels. This earthquake made the news. This earthquake had a magnitude 6.3 earthquake underneath Christchurch, New Zealand, and the shaking intensity of this earthquake was significant enough to cause the collapse of 2 buildings, heavily damage many other buildings, and economically made other buildings difficult to repair, so they were torn down for economic reasons. The picture on the left was taken just about a week before the magnitude 6.3 earthquake. The picture on the right was taken about 4 years after the earthquake. After many of those buildings in downtown were taken down or demolished for either economic reasons or because they were unsafe to occupy and it was too difficult to repair those buildings. This magnitude 6.3 earthquake, although relatively small on the magnitude scale, caused considerable amount of shaking underneath the city and had great impact on the city of Christchurch and the country of New Zealand. I was in New Zealand last October and had the opportunity of witnessing firsthand some of the damage that's still evident from that earthquake 7 years after the earthquake. The picture on the left is the Christchurch Cathedral, very famous building. It was extremely heavily damaged in the earthquake. It was scheduled to be torn down, but the community outcry said, no, we've got to save this building. It still hasn't been started yet in its retrofit. The building on the right was damaged by the earthquake and the bracing was put up, and that bracing is still there on that building. There are still office buildings that are standing that cannot be occupied, that still have not yet been repaired. This building in this photo did not collapse, but after the earthquake, it was disassembled. And this is what's left of the foundation. I'm not sure why it's still in this condition, but that's still more evidence of what still remains from that small magnitude 6.3 earthquake. So what point I'd like to be making this morning is that it's not just enough to know the magnitude of an earthquake. It's all about the shake and the quake. We need to have our conversation move from earthquakes and magnitudes to shaking levels that occurred in those earthquakes. So how do we measure or quantify shaking levels? The USGS has an intensity scale, and for my discussions today, I'd like to use that intensity scale as a proxy for our shaking levels. This scale goes from 1 to 10. It uses colors that go from blues and greens to yellows and oranges to reds and dark reds. And it also has some descriptions about each of those different levels that go from not felt to extreme and violent. The USGS uses this scale after an earthquake to produce maps. These maps are called shake map, and shake map is like a contour map with the levels of greatest shaking in the center of the map, and then the contours tend to diminish as you get away from those high levels or the highest levels of shaking. This map right here is of the Christchurch earthquake. It helps us understand why the Christchurch earthquake was so significant. You'll see that under the downtown area, there are a few triangles that are colored red. So the downtown area of Christchurch, New Zealand experienced red shaking intensity. That caused significant damage to the structural systems. And then you'll see that those contours tend to move out fairly rapidly outside of the city down to levels that did not cause nearly the level of damage. One thing I want you to look at on this slide before I show you the next one is the scale in the lower left. You'll see that the top line is a 10-kilometer distance, because that's important as we look at this next shake map. that scale on this map is 50 kilometers. So you can see that this magnitude 8.8 earthquake significantly affected a significantly larger area in Chile. The other thing that you'll see in this map is there are very few red triangles or circles, which means that the Christchurch earthquake had higher shaking intensity levels than the Chile earthquake. So if you think about what this earthquake would have been like if we had had red here instead of oranges and yellows, that would have been a much more significant earthquake. Unfortunately, it was only yellows and orange. There was a lot of damage from this, but it would have been significantly worse had we seen the red shaking intensity. So just hearing about the magnitudes does not help us understand the levels of shaking. I've got an app on my phone that alerts me whenever there's a magnitude 7.0 earthquake or larger anywhere in the world. When I get that alert, the first thing I do is go to the USGS website, click the event page, and look and see what the shaking intensity level is. If I see yellows or oranges, I know that there could be damage. But if I see reds, I know it could be a much different event because I'm looking at shaking intensities, not just the magnitude. So it really is all about the shake and the quake. So it's the severity of the ground shaking that causes damage. And as that severity of ground shaking increases, our level of damage will increase. It's also a function of the type of construction that was in the particular area. Some areas of the world, we worry a lot about shaking intensities that are going to be in those yellow and oranges because those buildings could collapse at that level of shaking. With our current seismic designs, we don't, at least if we're designed to current codes, we don't worry too much about those levels of shaking. But I'm going to give a caveat to that in just a minute when we talk about our seismic designs. So let me give you a hypothetical headline, but this one really isn't hypothetical. It happened last year in the fall. Magnitude 7.0 earthquake strikes Anchorage. When I got that alert on my phone, I immediately went to my boss and I said, a magnitude 7.0 earthquake happened in Anchorage 20 minutes ago. Is it a significant event? Does that headline give me enough information to know if it's a significant event? It doesn't. He said to me, I don't know. What was the level of shaking? I go, yeah, you got it. Because I'd given him this presentation. He understands that magnitude does not give him enough information to know how significant it is. So here's a shake map of the Anchorage earthquake. You'll see mostly yellows and oranges. And as you know from the news, we didn't get a lot of significant structural damage. There was a lot of damage, but not significant. We didn't hear about any collapses of buildings in this earthquake. This could have been a different event had those shaking intensities been red. So we get this headline, magnitude 7 earthquake strikes Anchorage. Most areas thankfully experience light shaking intensity. Unfortunately, we did not get this headline. Magnitude 7 earthquake strikes Anchorage, large areas of extreme shaking. Because those two are two different events. And just knowing the magnitude does not give us all the picture. So the paradigm shift I would like, not just you in this room and those online, but everybody, I'd like to get this message across to the news organizations. Give us a magnitude, but more important, tell us about the shaking. So let me shift gears here. A magnitude is acceleration. For this discussion, I'm trying to take technical terms out, but as far as engineers go, when I talk about shaking, it's usually a level of shaking and acceleration. It could also be velocity depending on our type or period of the structure, but generally it's an acceleration. So I want to shift gears here. I want to talk about my grandkids for just a minute. I've got 6 grandkids. I love them. They're great. And these are 2 of them. This picture was taken on Lexi's 3rd birthday. And she's standing next to her cousin James. And in this photo, James is going to turn 2 the day after. They were born a year in one day, or just under a year apart. So in this photo, James is still 1 year old. He is a big boy. And Lexi is just this little petite sweetheart. So when I think that every one of you have got children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews, and I'm sure the parents have taken them to the doctor, and we always want to ask after their 3-year-old appointment. Mom comes home and says, Lexi is in the 10th percentile. Or James comes home and they say, James is in the 70th percentile. What does that mean? What's the 70th percentile? If mom comes home and says James is in the 70th percentile for his height, okay. So if you just take James out in the community and look at all the 2-year-olds, he would be taller than about 30% of them, and about 70% of those boys his age would be shorter than him. In the 10th percentile, if you go out in the community, if you put 100 children that same age in a room, 10% would be shorter and about 90% would be larger. I want to give you the percentage here of Lexi. Lexi is the 4th percentile on her height. And James is the 98th percentile. So if James goes out into public and looked at every 2-year-old that he could find, would he find very many 2-year-olds that would be taller than him? Not very likely. Lexi, on the other hand, almost every girl her age is taller than her, because she is way at the low end of that percentile scale. Here's another one of my grandsons. This is Liam. He's Lexi's brother. He's an average boy. He loves to giggle, he loves to tease his sister, and he loves to climb trees. He's just average. He's about 50th percentile on his height. So I've got the whole range of grandchildren. I've got Lexi on the 4th percentile, I've got James on the 98th, and I've got Liam right in the middle. So I want to use James and Liam and Lexi to represent some variation, because children have variation in terms of their height at specific ages. One of the things I think we can understand pretty well is popcorn. If you put popcorn in the microwave, it doesn't all explode at the same time. You get some popcorn kernels that pop early, you get a big crescendo of popping that happens in the middle time, and then you get those stragglers that tend to go out there and pop, and then pop, and then pop. So if I let Lexi represent those kernels of popcorn that are going to pop really early, and I let James represent those kernels of popcorn that are going to pop way at the end, and Liam kind of represents those kernels that are going to crescendo right in the middle of that popping process. Now, if I give everybody in this room, and those of you online, I give you a kernel of popcorn, and we put them all in the same microwave, could you tell me when that kernel is going to pop? You could make a guess, but you might be lucky, but you're not going to be able to say when that kernel is going to pop. But let me ask you an easier question. Is your kernel of popcorn going to pop after Lexi's? Probably. Not for sure, but probably. Because Lexi's down at the 4th percentile, and most of your popcorn is going to pop after that. Let me ask you another easy question. Is yours going to pop before James? Most likely. There's only 2% probability that your kernel would pop after James. Those are easy questions to answer. It's pretty likely it'll pop after Lexi, pretty unlikely that it'll pop after James. What if I say, will it pop before Liam? That's a tougher question. It's a toss of the coin, 50-50. A little bit more difficult. So anyway, those types of questions help us understand natural variation and help us ask questions different than what's the time my kernel's going to pop. A couple of years ago, well, it was about 4 years ago now, I went to Home Depot and they had fluorescent light bulbs on sale by the caseload. I'd never seen fluorescent light bulbs that cheap, so I bought a couple of cases. This was right before they wanted to get rid of all their fluorescent light bulbs and replace them with LED light bulbs. So I still have fluorescent light bulbs at my house, and these things don't burn out. 20,000 hours, double life, you can see there. So light bulbs, do they burn out at 20,000 hours? On average, probably. But if I gave each of you a light bulb and we put them in and we waited 2.5 years, would they all burn out at the same time? No, they're going to change. Some of those would burn out. If we let Lexi represent those light bulbs that are going to burn out very early and James represent those at the very end, I could ask you the same question. Is yours going to burn out after Lexi's? Probably after Lexi's, and it'll probably burn out before James. Not quite sure on Liam. It's a little bit tougher to ask. So there's natural variation in children, there's natural variation in popcorn, there's natural variation in light bulbs, and almost anything that occurs in nature, there is natural variation. Now that's important because earthquakes are no different. There is natural variation in earthquakes. So it's difficult and impossible for us to say this earthquake will cause this level of shaking. We can't do that. But we can give you a range. We can predict what the 4th percentile shaking intensity will be. We can predict what the 98th percentile shaking intensity will be. And we can predict what the 50th or median percentile shaking intensity will be. And there are things that occur around faults that we can take where Liam and Lexi and James are and adjust those. We can move those left or right. We can take the range and move it together. We can do all those things, but we cannot predict a specific level of shaking. So knowing the type of fault, knowing the distance from the fault, knowing the type of soil underneath your site, knowing information about the fault can help us either move those ranges left, move them right, or bring them closer together, or spread them further apart. And that's important as we talk about earthquake risk, to know that we cannot predict, but we can give you ranges. So let me give you a few things. And these are kind of a repeat of what I've said before, but we know that different locations will receive different ground motions. We know that one magnitude 7 earthquake will cause different shaking than another magnitude 7 earthquake. We know that ground shaking is most likely to occur somewhere near the middle range, near Liam. We know that it's very unlikely that the shaking intensity will exceed the Lexi shaking, or we know it's very unlikely that it will exceed it. We know that it's very unlikely that the shaking intensity will exceed James. We know it's impossible to predict what the exact shaking will be, but we can predict the range of potential ground motions. And we know that there are things that affect where we would place Lexi, Liam, and James, such as the distance from a fault, the type of soil under the location, and the depth to rock. Those are all things that we do know about earthquakes. So I live in Salt Lake City, Utah. We have a big fault just east of us. It's called the Wasatch Fault. In general, we expect to see a magnitude 7 or magnitude 7.2 earthquake on that fault when it ruptures. So if somebody came to me and said, this building is really important to me, I want it designed for a magnitude 7 earthquake on the Wasatch Fault. Do I have enough information to design that building? I don't. Because I could say, okay, well, let's design it for Lexi. Let's take those ground motions and we'll design it. It's a potential shaking. But that's not wise to do that. I could say, well, let's design it for James, 98th percentile shaking intensity. We're pretty likely we won't exceed that, so let's make this thing bulletproof. But that would cost a lot of money because that 98th percentile on the Wasatch Fault is way out there in terms of the level of shaking. It would be very uneconomical to design that. What about if we say, let's design it to Liam, right in the middle? You comfortable with that? No, maybe not. What the USGS and the code writers have done in areas where where we're required to design to specific levels of shaking, they use the 84th percentile. That's one standard deviation away from the median. And they say at that level of shaking, we don't want that building to collapse. So that's kind of the level that the code writers have said, 84th percentile, we're comfortable with that. Let's not have building collapse if a building receives that 84th percentile. We'll talk about code shaking in just a minute to add a little bit to that discussion. So let's talk building codes. I've talked a lot about looking in the past, about measuring shaking intensities, looking at shaking intensities from past earthquakes. But the building code is really trying to look into the future. And it's saying we need to design buildings for a certain level of shaking. So let's look at what building codes look at for shaking intensity. But the first thing I want to make clear is that building codes do not make buildings earthquake proof. We need to remove that from our seismic language. I have heard that way too many times from the public thinking that the building code makes their buildings earthquake proof. So this arrow represents a level of shaking that the code writers have to determine. They have to pick for the code a level of shaking. They call that level of shaking that they have to determine the MCE with the subscript R, meaning risk reduced. Now MCE was developed back in the 2000 IBC building code. It stands for maximum considered earthquake. Now, if this is a shaking intensity level, why did the code writers call this an earthquake? I don't know. But engineers have got in their mind that we design to an earthquake. And we don't. We design to a shaking intensity. And way too many times, including many times at this conference, I have heard engineers talk about designing to this earthquake. My message today is we should call this the maximum considered earthquake shaking intensity or ground motion. In technical terms, it's called a response acceleration. And I encourage every engineer in this audience, online, and those that hear this after this presentation, to never use MCE alone, but always add the words shaking intensity, response acceleration, ground motion, to clearly indicate to the public that we are designing to a ground motion and we are not designing to an earthquake. The other thing the code writers did is they called this a maximum, the maximum considered. This is the maximum level you have to consider, because this shaking intensity can always be exceeded. It's just a level that they had to set, and we'll talk about how they set that in just a minute. But they are saying this is the maximum considered. I actually consider this the minimum, because if I'm designing a building, the code does not allow me to use an SS or an S1 less than this value. So if I were rewriting the code, I would call this the minimum considered shaking intensity. So the code writers had to set that somewhere. Every location in the United States has to have this MCER shaking intensity set somewhere. The code writers could move it left and increase the risk and decrease the cost. They could set it to the right, where they would increase the cost and reduce the risk. It's a balance between cost and risk, and they had to set it somewhere. So they set this to a level of risk of collapse. Basically, every building in the United States, theoretically, if all we had to consider was earthquakes, When you throw wind in there, it changes this. But if all we did was look at earthquakes, every location in the United States would have the same risk of collapse from an earthquake. Because in areas of low risk, we move that MCER shaking intensity to the left. In areas like California, Oregon, Washington, Utah, we move it to the right. So that each location in the United States has the same level of risk. So that 1 over 5,000 is the level of risk. They set that level so that every building has that 1 over 5,000 per year risk of collapse. Now, I also put on here that if a building is a code level building, a type 2 classification, which is a typical residence or typical office building, if that building is designed to code and if an earthquake causes that shaking intensity, that MCER shaking intensity, the code said we should have no more than a 10% probability that that building collapses. So one is including the probability that that event happens to cause that level of shaking. The other is if that shaking happens, then there should be no more than a 10% probability of collapse. So this is intended just for the engineers. If I didn't have engineers in the audience and I was just talking to a non-technical audience, I wouldn't put this slide in here. But you know that over the last code cycles, we switched from an MCE to an MCER. So the MCER is based upon a probability that a shaking level will not be exceeded. 2% probability that that shaking level would be exceeded in 50 years. So we moved from the MCE to the MCE with a lowercase r to represent risk, which is the 1 over 5,000 risk of collapse. So it moved it from a shaking level of probability that shaking happens to the probability that this building would collapse in 50 years. Now, in Utah, along the Wasatch Front, that caused a reduction in ground shaking of about 0.85, 15% reduction. Other places in the country, it's a little bit different, but in Utah, we design now for a shaking that's about 15% less than if the code had not changed from an MCE to an MCER. This is one of the USGS seismic hazard maps. What this map shows is the likelihood of ground shaking that will not be exceeded in 50 years. So if you look in the area around St. Louis, down near Memphis, you'll see there's a big patch of red. So in order to not exceed a specific ground motion, you would have to design to a pretty high level there because that's a potential area of high shaking. Over in Charleston, South Carolina, there's an area of red. You'll see California has quite a bit of red. Portland and Seattle have some dark orange. Basically, this is a map that just kind of shows you where some high levels of shaking are more likely to occur than others. A lot of the country, we are in the light blues and grays, which says that this level of shaking is what we would expect. If you design to this, there's a very low probability that it would ever be exceeded, a 2% probability in 50 years. This is what the code writers use to set the MCER shaking intensity. This is based on the MCE, and then they adjust this for the risk factors to come up with the MCER. But the thing I want to point out is that if you live in Boston, Baltimore, Chicago, St. Louis, Portland, Seattle, you all have the same risk of building collapse. So some of you that live in some of these lower seismic areas, you think, I don't have to worry about earthquakes because they don't happen here, but the risk is the same for you as it is for those that live in Seattle and Portland. The difference is we require buildings in Portland and Seattle to be designed to a higher level of shaking than we do in Chicago and Baltimore and Boston. So just want to make sure it's clear that we all have the same risk of collapse. Generally, there's a few exceptions. In California, where they take the lower of that risk of collapse and then use an earthquake and use the 84th percentile. So that gets back to the discussion I had earlier about the 84th percentile, because they take the lower of the risk of collapse and that 84th percentile, and if it's lower, then the risk of collapse is actually greater in California because they didn't go clear out to that 1/5,000. So what happens to a building if we design a typical code-conforming office building if it sees that MCER shaking intensity? Well, it could be heavily damaged. It should have no more than a 10% probability of collapse. The building on the left is from Christchurch, New Zealand. You can see that this building is heavily damaged. That column in the corner is at risk of collapse, so this building is not able to be occupied. The goal in the building code is to get people out of a building safely and that the building doesn't collapse upon them. Aftershocks could cause the collapse of buildings that were not collapsed in the main event. So the code realizes that we are pushing buildings clear to the edge of their ability to resist loads, get them out of the building, and most likely either aftershocks will cause them to collapse or we'll have to demolish them after they see that level of shaking. It's kind of like disposable buildings. Now this other image here shows you also what the code allows to happen if a building sees the MCER shaking level. It does not require us to check for cladding failure if a building sees that level of shaking. Now there are some guidelines and there is a movement towards saying this is a big deal. If I'm in downtown San Francisco, I don't want to have cladding raining down upon my head. The code right now does not require that. This is allowed in the current code, but we're moving towards not allowing this. And the Tall Building Council says this is not acceptable behavior. We don't want this to happen. But heavily damaged, near collapse, that's what the code allows us for buildings that see this MCER shaking intensity. So what if we experience a shaking intensity that's about 2/3 of what that MCER shaking intensity is? How do we expect buildings to perform at this lower level of shaking? Well, let's look at that. So here's some of the damage that could happen. It could experience costly damage, both structural and architectural. There is a low probability of collapse. It can safely experience aftershocks. The architectural components of the building should stay attached, not like we saw in that video. We would expect all cladding to stay attached if a building experiences this shaking level. And the damage could be significant enough that the building may be uneconomical to repair. And in some cases, rebuilding may be the cheapest option. Now, we design hospitals and fire stations and police stations to be stronger and stiffer than our typical office buildings. And by making them stronger and stiffer, we expect that they become operational if they experience this level of shaking. Now, I'm going to put up, in here, I put in capital letters and in quotes the word design. And I put it in capital letters with quotes because that has a specific engineering meaning. For the non-technical audience, we design buildings to not collapse in the MCER. We design them to have better performance in this 2/3 MCER. But to the code writers and to the engineers, this is our design level event. So if we say we're designing this building to be operational after an earthquake, what we're really saying is we're designing this building to be operational if it experiences the 2/3 MCER shaking intensity. If that earthquake causes the MCER shaking intensity, that hospital may not be operational because it's experiencing greater ground motion, 50% increase in ground motion from the design shaking intensity. And we as engineers don't give that information well enough to the public to understand that. In my community in Salt Lake City, everybody thinks that our hospitals will be operational after a Wasatch Fault earthquake. And that is not the case. They may be lucky enough to get ground shaking below Liam, and if they get that ground shaking below where Liam was, then they could be operational. But if they get that ground shaking that's up toward James, there's a very low likelihood that those hospitals will be operational. And see, as we talk shaking intensity, we can talk those sorts of discussions because it moves the discussion away from earthquakes and magnitudes back to shaking intensity, where we can have those discussions. So we've already read those about our possible damage. So let's review a couple of things. Magnitude affects area and duration. There's natural variation of earthquakes, allows prediction of shaking only within ranges. Code shaking level is a balance between risk and cost. If we experience MCER shaking, we could be near collapse. If we experience design shaking, we could experience significant damage. So let's talk now about public expectations and acceptable risk. I think this is an area that we as engineers are really failing the public on. I don't think we convey the risks that the code writers have built into the building code to our clients, to our owners, to business owners, and to the public. They think that we are protecting them from all levels of shaking intensity. But we are protecting them against a very specific level of shaking intensity, which the code writers have given us to design to. And I don't think we communicate that well enough to the public. And if they experience shaking intensities that cause some of these levels of shaking, like the MCER shaking, I really think we're going to have a disappointed public. We're going to have disappointed building owners. Many of them are thinking that we're protecting them against this MCER shaking level, but in reality, they could be very disappointed when they have to tear their building down after they just finished it and got an MCER level of shaking. We need to communicate the risk that the code writers have built into the code. And if we can communicate that to building owners, to business owners, to community leaders, and we communicate to them what the code risks are, then they can maybe accept it or say, that's unacceptable to me. I cannot live with that risk. This building is very important to me. I have to have this building after whatever level of shaking this earthquake could cause. But unless we communicate that to them, we're not giving them that opportunity to make that choice. So let's talk resilience design versus code design. Code design basically gives us disposable buildings. They're safe, but they're disposable. There have been several presentations today, this week, which I hope you have gone to, that discuss this resilience design. There's discussions going on right now throughout the United States where people are saying code level design is not adequate. We need to get our communities back functioning after that earthquake. The USRC has created these ratings, building rating system. A code level building receives the certified rating. And if engineers and owners decide we can do better, they can rate buildings based upon their performance to this design level shaking. I don't think the USRC is very good at conveying that we are rating buildings against a design level shaking, the 2/3 MCER. They don't want to confuse the public with what I'm trying to tell you today. But it's clear in their literature that this rating goes with the design level shaking intensity. But it still gives you an opportunity to compare one building against another. And if a platinum building is compared against a silver building, you can know that the platinum building is going to perform better no matter what the shaking will be. I really like this opportunity of giving building owners an opportunity of seeing what the rating is for that building. There's another thing that we can do as engineers. Now we have tools given to us with the FEMA P58, and the SP3 software allows us to give building owners much more information than your building will be safe after this earthquake or this shaking level. they can tell us now comparisons of buildings. They can say, let's take a code-conforming building, and we will tell you what the damage level will be, what the recovery level will be for that building. But if you're willing to spend X amount of dollars, maybe 0.5% of your building cost, and let us do some things, we can tell you what your damage and your recovery time differences will be compared to a code-conforming building. What if, and then we can look at that and say, well, if we do this different, we could save you this much money. If we do that, we could save you this much money in different levels of shaking. It's giving us tools now so we can go have an informed decision or discussion with building owners and let them make a cost-benefit decision. So we're going to see more and more of this as time progresses, where we're looking more at resilient buildings rather than just your code level, it's safe to get out, we're going to now tear down the building approach of the building code. So the building code gives what they term an acceptable risk. That's an acceptable risk for a particular building, for a particular building owner. If a building owner has multiple buildings around the country, a particular building in a specific location, the acceptable risk that the building code gives us may be acceptable to that business owner. But if that business owner, that's his only or her only place of business, and they're given that opportunity to say, is this code level an acceptable risk for you, they can make that decision. But if we look at an individual building compared to an entire community, the answer changes. So what if we take that individual risk and put all of those together into one community? What happens to a city if thousands of their residents cannot go back home? What happens if thousands of the school students cannot go to school? And what happens if thousands of people cannot go back to work because the business is not operational? Now we're looking at the risk to the community, not just a risk to a specific business or individual. It's a different answer. Because if you think about it, if I'm in a community after an earthquake, I need a place to live, I need a place for my kids to go to school, and I need a place for me to go to work and earn an income. Those are key things. And if you look at a community, I think the answer is different when we look at risk. And that's why it's important for us to, and that's why the country is moving towards this idea of functional recovery. We need to get communities back operational. And this idea that the building code has given us in the past of specific buildings may not be the right answer when we give a bigger community perspective. And this is a good example, Christchurch, New Zealand. All of these buildings performed as the building code said they would. This earthquake caused an MCE, our shaking level. And we know that we could see code-conforming buildings collapse if they receive that level of shaking. These buildings allowed the occupants that didn't collapse, allowed the occupants to get out. But what the code did not do is it did not give them functional performance and a way to get back into those buildings quickly. The downtown area was cordoned off for years. Anybody that worked or lived in that central business district was not allowed to enter that district. This was a very difficult recovery because the building code did what it was supposed to do, but it didn't help with community. So I'd like to finish up here with just our learning objective question. I'm going to ask for a brave volunteer to help answer this question. Explain why it is more important to know the shaking intensity than the earthquake magnitude to understand building damage. Anybody brave enough to answer that question? I'm going to call on Jim Snow.
Because if you only know the magnitude, you don't necessarily know how much the ground shook at your site.
Okay, so Jim said, if you only know the magnitude, you don't know the level of shaking that occurred at your site. Because it really is all about the shake. We have to understand shaking intensity to know the level of damage. So let's summarize. Let's talk and focus on shaking, not magnitude. Let's talk building performance expectations. Let's talk about the risks to a community, not just about the risk to individual buildings. And let's talk about the shake in the quake. And let's do it all in a language we can all understand. Thank you. So we've got about 5 minutes for questions. We're online, so if you're online and would like a question typed, just go ahead and type that in, and that will be relayed to me. Question.
How long did the shaking last for the Christchurch earthquake?
How long did the shaking last for the Christchurch earthquake? The significant shaking lasted less than 10 seconds. I didn't quite hear that. I heard the question is there anything in the building code that addresses the community risk and damage to the community? Moving forward in the building code. Yes, in future building codes, I am certain we will have community risk as part of our design criteria. Currently, it does not have that in our codes. The big term that FEMA is using is functional recovery. That is something very big that you will start hearing more and more and more and more and more about is functional recovery. And that will then start to move building codes to require certain types of buildings, at least, to be designed to have a functional recovery.
As far as the intensity of shaking goes, which factor governs the most? Is it the distance from the epicenter? Is it the soil type?
So the question is, as far as the intensity of shaking goes, what's the most important factor that affects the shaking? So I'm not a scientist, and I'm going to take a stab at this, and I may have some scientists correct me after this. I think distance to the fault is one of the biggest things. And the reason I say that is if you see in the news a magnitude 7.5 earthquake occurring in Peru, for example, and you go to the event page and realize that shaking occurred 200 kilometers below the surface, and the shaking gets up to the surface, it's not very large because it's a distance of where that rupture actually occurred. So shaking or distance to the fault is probably in my mind, the biggest. Some of the other factors that I think make a big difference is the type of fault. In California, we get strike-slip faults that tend to move side by side. In Salt Lake City, we've got a normal fault which tends to move on an angle vertically. That tends to generate larger ground shaking than the strike-slip faults. And if you're on the hanging wall, which is the side above the fault plane, that tends to shake more than if you're on the footwall side. So where you are in relationship to the fault could also affect it, and that kind of relates to distance. But soil type is another very important thing. So let's assume that the ground shaking down low is the same in two sites, but one site has a softer soil profile, the other has a harder soil profile. The softer soil profile could have significantly greater effects to a building than the one on the harder rock soil. Shaking, I've brought it down to a very simple terms of shaking. In reality, you can have your master's degree in shaking. You can have your PhD in shaking. I've brought it down to a single term. As we as engineers talk about it, it's about this big, but if you get with a seismologist, it's about this big, and you add the geoscience into there, it becomes this big. I've collected it all into a single term for our discussions because I'm not really trying to tell you what the shaking will be. I'm just saying that it's really important to know what the shaking is and what it could be. So the question is, what percentage of buildings fell down or taken down? I don't know the percentage. I can tell you that 2 buildings collapsed, and I can show you that image from Christchurch, and you could see how much bare space there was 4 years after the earthquake. So it kind of gives you an idea, but I have no idea in terms of the percentage. As I look at those pictures, it was less than 50%, but it was a significant amount of the downtown area. Okay, we're at time. I appreciate your time. If you've got more questions, come on up and ask me after.